We often use modal verbs as they are a vital component of English grammar and frequently appear in everyday conversation. However, there is one that is sometimes overlooked. In this video, we're going to look at ought to. Ought to is similar to should, but sounds a little more formal and sometimes maybe a little old-fashioned. But people still use it, and it is still useful in some situations. If we want to avoid spoofed packets, we ought to enable client hardware address checks. In this example, we're giving advice about how to avoid a potentially difficult problem. Should also works in this sentence, but as it is a professional situation, something more formal and serious like ought to is appropriate. This comprehensive procedure ought to have been introduced already, in my opinion. The default configuration situation is now urgent. In this sentence, we are expressing the opinion that something has been necessary for some time and should have been done already. We ought to have a VLAN-based configuration in our network. We can see again in this example that we're making a professional suggestion, offering advice on what we consider to be the right course of action in order to resolve an issue. Like our first example, should also works in this sentence, but ought to has a more formal register and the sentence sounds more professional as a result. One last important thing to remember is that ought to is the only modal verb that includes to. You ought to remember that. So, if you're looking for something more polite, or you fancy a change, you ought to use ought to.